Ma'am, you're not allowed in this room. Step away from that table. Lieutenant Jace Rowan raised his hand stiffly in front of Commander Naomi Reyes, as if he were blocking a complete stranger who had accidentally wandered into a classified area. Naomi continued pouring the coffee, her movement steady, revealing no reaction to his tone. Rowan immediately raised his voice, firmer, sharper. Officer spouses or administrative staff have no business in here. This is a classified briefing. Please step outside. The briefing room fell quiet. A few officers glanced over, clear irritation on their faces, yet no one spoke up. Naomi responded gently. I am an attendee, Lieutenant. Rowan didn't believe her. He extended his hand. Your ID card. When Naomi handed it to him, he scrutinized every edge, every detail, as if checking for a cheap counterfeit. Seeing the 04 rank he still insisted could be an administrative error, he walked over to the auxiliary verification station, slid the card in, and pressed each key loudly and forcefully, making sure everyone in the room could hear. Every pair of eyes slowly shifted toward Naomi, forming a heavy pressure that settled across the entire room. Rowan turned back with a mocking smile. Aviation. You're probably public affairs or meteorology. You're not a pilot. Naomi stood tall, the gold wings on her chest stirring memories of the countless nighttime carrier landings she had survived in total darkness over the ocean. At the far end of the table, Colonel Avery Knox studied her closely. His gaze stopped at the squadron patch on her shoulder, and in an instant he understood. Spectre, the one who had saved his Marines during the smoke-choked chaos in Helmand. Without another thought, he pulled out his phone and sent a short, urgent message. Sir Spectre is being thrown out of the briefing room. Across several buildings, Admiral Holt saw the name Spectre Reyes flash across his screen and shot to his feet, needing no further explanation. If you believe true courage is not found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have walked through war, then subscribe to veterans' legacy stories, so we can preserve the memories, the dignity, and the honor of our quiet heroes. Naomi stood still by the coffee counter, her hand wrapped around the small ceramic cup that was still warm. The noise from moments earlier seemed to collapse in on itself, leaving only a compressed heaviness pressing against her back like a dense layer of air. The hum of the air conditioner continued, but it drifted farther and farther away, fading, as if pulled into some bottomless distance, leaving behind a silence in which she could hear her heartbeat clearly. She lowered her eyes to the gold wings on her chest. The frayed threads worn down by parachute straps, by hours in a harness during damp night flights heavy with fuel and salt, each small tear marking a moment spent on the knife edge between life and death. A flash of memory surged up without warning. A blacked-out runway, a carrier deck tilting with every swell of the sea, the roar of the F-414 engines ripping the sky and ocean apart, the air thick with the scent of metal and brine. Naomi felt again the violent jolt when the arresting hook caught the cable, slamming her back into her seat like she had hit an invisible wall. In that instant, her spine remembered the sensation of coming back alive and almost losing everything. People think nighttime traps are just another mission, but for her, each one was a brush with the boundary between staying and vanishing. She drew in a long breath, steadying her heartbeat, letting her body return to the present. Her eyes settled into that familiar stillness one only pilots who have stared into the deepest darkness over open ocean could possess. A stillness not born of weakness, but the invisible armor of those who have grown accustomed to chaos. No one else in the room knew that inside that silence, Naomi could hear the imagined footsteps of fallen comrades moving through her mind. The ones who never returned from missions she had led. Names she never spoke aloud, but always carried with her each time she touched the gold wings on her chest. Just a few steps away, Colonel Avery Knox still hadn't looked away from the Black Knight's patch on her sleeve. He recognized every line, every symbol, every worn corner that outsiders would never understand. It wasn't just a patch. It was a mark belonging to those who had walked through places where a single misstep could cost a life. The initial doubt in Knox's eyes disappeared completely. In its place was a chilling certainty. More than anyone in that room, he knew that the name Spectre was not merely a call sign. It was a story told through hundreds of quiet thank yous, and the very thing feared by enemies who had never seen her face but knew the sound of the Super Hornet leading the formation overhead. Naomi sensed Knox's gaze but didn't look back. She didn't need to. Those who have fought shoulder to shoulder in fire and dust always recognize one another through things no one else can see. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It felt like the silence shared by people who know too much about war and understand all too clearly the price of peace. Around the room, the other officers slowly returned to their papers, though they kept glancing at Naomi with unspoken confusion. A woman calmly pouring coffee, standing in the face of doubt, without anger, without protest, wearing a pair of worn gold wings. There was something in that image that forced them to think. And it was that quiet composure that pushed Rowan into an even harsher spotlight than before. Naomi set the cup down, her fingers brushing the darkened patch on her sleeve where the Black Knight's insignia had once been singed. She had repaired it, but the mark had never fully disappeared. People often say patches are just decoration. But to her it was a relative of memory, a reminder of the soldiers who never came home, the ones she had promised herself she would never forget. She straightened her shoulders, tightening, as if bracing for another incoming wave. And in that moment, no one needed to be a military expert to see that Naomi's stillness wasn't retreat. It was a storm holding itself together before rising. And just as that stillness was beginning to take shape, the next wave of insults suddenly crashed in, shattering the taut air stretched through the room. Rowan suddenly raised his voice, directing it across the entire room, as if he were standing on a command platform. "We can't be too careful. Fraudulent insignia is a federal offense." His words sliced through the tense air, sharp and cold. A wave of uneasy murmurs rippled outward, heavy breaths, the rustle of papers being folded, the faint sound of someone shaking their head. Yet no one intervened. The silence felt like an invisible approval, and Naomi felt clearly how alone she was standing in that room. The word fraudulent struck her ears like a hidden blow. Not fear, but the sensation of her dignity being pierced straight through. It hurt more than any jolt from a night trap slamming onto a carrier deck, more than the crushing force of an arresting cable when she and her entire squadron faced the roaring black ocean. Naomi didn't move, but her eyes dimmed for a moment. In that brief instant, a battlefield memory dragged her back to a night she would never forget. A radio transmission came through, rough and trembling under the sound of bullets tearing the air. "Spectre, we're pinned down." The voice of a young ranger mixed with desperation, and the last sliver of trust he still had. Naomi remembered exactly what she had said. Back remembered the altitude she dropped to, an altitude every pilot knew was a razor-thin line between mission success and death. Then the explosion thundered from the ground, a burst of red fire rising beneath thick smoke. A machine gun nest went silent. A unit was saved. That memory had no music, no glory. Only the metallic smell inside the cockpit, the pounding of her own heartbeat, and the choked thank you from someone on the other end of the radio. Those were the truths behind her gold wings, the reason she wore them on her chest, not for pride, but for the people who survived, because she did her job. Rowan didn't know, and perhaps didn't care. He pushed on harsher, more aggressive. "Commander, step out, or security will remove you." His voice sounded like a verdict, intentionally loud, so everyone could hear. A few officers looked away, avoiding Naomi's eyes. Others pressed their lips together as if trying to understand how an O4 could be treated like a criminal. The entire room froze. The silence seemed to take Rowan's side, a pressure weighing entirely on Naomi's shoulders. But one man refused to accept that silence, Colonel Avery Knox. His hands trembled not from fear, but from anger. He had encountered Spectre on the battlefield, had heard her voice wrap around him through layers of gunfire, had known she wasn't just a pilot, but the final lifeline connecting soldiers on the ground to their chance of survival. He closed his eyes for a second to steady himself. A truth being insulted always wounds those who have witnessed that truth with their own eyes. Naomi looked straight at Rowan. No anger, no protest, only the stillness of someone who had lived through far more than this room could comprehend. She didn't respond. Her silence was a blade sharp enough to make several officers swallow hard. She wasn't afraid of being removed. The only thing that truly hurt was hearing the wings she wore as a promise to fallen comrades be called fake. Naomi's hand moved instinctively to the sleeve where the Black Knight's patch rested. A small gesture, but to her it was the place where memories of those who never returned lay quiet. Touching it was like speaking the names she never dared to say aloud, names Rowan would never understand. She drew a breath, reclaiming her familiar composure. She wasn't afraid of humiliation. Someone who had survived storm-dark seas and anti-aircraft fire didn't fear an arrogant junior officer. What she feared were the invisible wounds, moral wounds that disrespect could inflict within the ranks of the military itself. The air tightened, ready to snap. Rowan narrowed his eyes, preparing another shove. Naomi knew it. Knox knew it. And everyone in the room felt that something had crossed a line. And just as the insult reached its final boundary, a quiet movement from elsewhere began to rise, signaling that change was coming faster than anyone in that room could realize. Knox could no longer stand still. He lowered his eyes to his phone, his fingers typing a few quick words, sharp, concise, and carrying the weight of a battlefield order. Admiral Holt. Now. The message was sent in less than a second. On the other end, the aide who saw the sender's name immediately stiffened. He didn't ask for clarification. He forwarded the message straight to the Admiral's office. Only a few breaths later, Admiral Holt looked at the notification on his screen. The name Spectre Reyes appeared, and his expression darkened like a cloud sweeping across a clear sky. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need details. One name alone was enough for him to understand the gravity of the situation. After years of reading battlefield reports and watching heroes step in and out of the line of death, very few names could make him stop what he was doing. Spectre Reyes was one of them. He tightened his grip around the brim of his cover and spoke in a low, steel-cold voice. "Bring my cover. Master Chief comes with me." The aide managed only one word in response. "Yes, sir." The atmosphere in Holt's office shifted instantly. Master Chief, the moral backbone of the entire command, approached with quick, purposeful steps, his chest covered in rows of ribbons faded by years of service. He didn't ask for an explanation. One look at Holt's face told him this was no ordinary matter. They left the office together, each footstep driving into the long hallway that led to the briefing room. Meanwhile, inside the secure briefing room, Rowan continued displaying his half-baked confidence. He stood tall with his hands behind his back as if supervising an internal inspection. "Your clearance isn't valid for this brief." The words came out stubborn and rigid as though he were clinging desperately to the authority he believed he possessed. Naomi stood a few steps away. Her eyes no longer held the gentle patience from earlier. The calmness remained, but now it was wrapped in the unshakable resolve of someone who had carried far heavier burdens than anything inside this room. She didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't justify herself, and that silence unsettled those around her. A person who didn't need to defend herself with words was often someone with enough history to let the truth defend her instead. Rowan glanced at her involuntarily, but instead of seeing the weakness he expected, he saw a stillness so steady it unnerved him. He felt as though he was standing in front of someone he couldn't define. A sudden chill ran down his spine, forcing him to stand straighter by instinct. He didn't understand why he felt it. He only knew his body was reacting to something his mind hadn't yet caught up with. At that same moment, out in the hallway, the footsteps of Admiral Holt and Master Chief struck the floor with heavy, deliberate rhythm. Each step was like a period in a sentence of truth moving steadily toward the room. Slow, sure, unstoppable. Anyone who passed them stepped aside, immediately recognizing this was no routine walk. Holt was known for his calm demeanor, but this time his stride was firmer, sharper. Master Chief followed close behind, his stern expression, that of someone ready to restore order across an entire command. The tension tightened inside the briefing room. Naomi stood straight, feeling the invisible weight settling across her shoulders, but not wavering. Knox glanced at the door, his own heartbeat urging it to open sooner, though the footsteps outside seemed to stretch time itself. Rowan, unaware of the specifics, still sensed that some unseen wire had been pulled taut. All that remained was for the door to open. And just as Rowan's arrogance reached its highest point, a movement from outside approached, serving as a warning that real authority was about to enter, and everything in the room was about to change in the span of a single breath. The briefing room door swung open sharply, as if pushed by an invisible force from behind. Every officer inside snapped to attention instinctively, none daring to turn their head. The silence, already tense, thickened to the point it felt like the room had shrunk barely large enough to contain the truth that was about to enter. Admiral Holt stepped in each footfall firm, carrying the weight of decades of service in his eyes. But he didn't look at anyone except Naomi Reyes. Every face waiting for an explanation blurred into insignificance. Only the image of the woman standing calmly by the coffee counter remained steady in the middle of a storm. He stopped in front of her. His gaze held no anger, only the certainty of someone who understood true worth. Spectre Holt said low and resonant, "I was wondering when you'd show up." The sound rippled across the room like a shockwave. Some people inhaled sharply. Some widened their eyes. Some lowered their heads to hide the embarrassment blooming across their faces. Rowan froze where he stood. Naomi's ID card was still pinched between his fingers, but they trembled so violently he could barely keep hold of it. Whatever confidence he had evaporated in a single heartbeat, leaving behind a hollow terror. He knew instantly that the name the Admiral spoke was no ordinary name. It was a title reserved for those known across the force by reputation alone, no photograph required. Holt turned to face the rows of officers. He didn't reach for notes, didn't prepare an introduction. The truth about Naomi was large enough to stand on its own. For those who haven't met her, Commander Naomi Reyes has more night traps than most wings log in an entire lifetime. A heavy exhale came from Master Chief, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet pride reserved for people like Naomi. That sound alone silenced the room completely. It carried a message no one needed translated. The woman standing before them was no ordinary officer. Holt continued, his voice steady, but each word sharpened by the backbone of a truth long established. She led the Kandahar extraction. 17 soldiers owe their lives to her decisions. Naomi didn't move. She didn't swell with pride, didn't flinch, didn't bow her head. Her steadiness made every word spoken about her carry even more weight. The officers in the room looked at her with a completely different expression, an unveiled respect, a silent acknowledgement for someone who had carried far more than they had ever imagined. They realized the frayed gold wings on her chest were not some easy decoration. They were evidence hundreds of moments where she put her body in the most dangerous position the military could demand. Blacked-out nights pitching carrier decks, restless seas, calls for support under the spray of gunfire from the ground. Several young officers felt their throats tighten. They had been wrong. Not just about a person, but about an entire story woven from silence and sacrifice, one they had never lived through. Naomi met Holt's gaze steadily. She didn't ask for protection. She didn't need anyone to speak for her, but in that moment with Holt standing before her, she understood something. The truth had finally been placed where it belonged. Knox stood behind her, lips pressed into a thin line, as if the truth he had known all along was finally being laid bare before everyone. He felt light, but also a sharp ache, because if Naomi hadn't remained calm, he might have lost the opportunity to stand up for what was right. The atmosphere in the room shifted slowly. It was no longer shock or regret, it became anticipation. A collective waiting for the full truth about the person they had all misjudged. Admiral Holt did not stop after his initial introduction. He took another step forward and continued, his voice low but sharp, as if recounting a truth no one had the right to dispute. Engine failure, partial hydraulics, visibility near zero, and she still brought her jet home instead of punching out. He delivered each word slowly, making sure everyone in the room understood this wasn't an exaggeration. Anyone who had ever served in naval aviation knew that doing such a thing meant placing one's life on a thread thinner than paper. Holt then turned his head, his eyes locking onto Lieutenant Rowan. This was no longer storytelling. This was a reminder, sharp as a blade. "That's not something public affairs officers do, Lieutenant." The room seemed to freeze. Rowan felt the word lieutenant nail him in place, as if his rank had just been restated to remind him he was standing far out of line. His hand trembled, the ID card in his fingers threatening to slip. The confidence he had clung to evaporated completely, replaced by the horrifying awareness that he was being held up as a living example of his own foolishness. Naomi remained perfectly composed. She didn't look at Rowan nor at anyone else, but in her eyes a familiar spark flickered, the same fire every pilot carries before stepping into a dangerous mission alert, sharp, ready to respond if necessary. Not to defend her ego, but to defend the truth. She stood straight, shoulders bearing the weight of countless nights on a carrier deck in the middle of a hostile sea. Knox could no longer stay silent. His breath came heavy, thick with emotion, but his words were unwavering. "Spectre saved my Marine platoon in Helmand. Without her, we'd have all died in that valley." He didn't need to raise his voice. Everyone heard him. A man like Knox, who had witnessed too much death, would never use the word saved lightly. His statement landed like a stamp pressed into steel, confirming what Holt said wasn't ceremonial praise. It was truth paid for in blood. A young officer seated near the door swallowed so hard he heard it himself. His back straightened, his eyes trembled. He realized he was witnessing a piece of living history, not from a book, not from retold stories, but from a living witness standing in the same room. He had never met a pilot whose call sign was attached to the survival of dozens of soldiers. And now she stood before him, calm, asking for no recognition, though she had earned it long ago. Holt turned back, pausing a moment, as if to give the room time to absorb the truth just unveiled. Then he addressed Naomi with solemn respect. "Commander Reyes, welcome to the brief. We need your expertise." Naomi gave a small nod. Not a bow, not a gesture of gratitude. Just the nod of someone who had stood in the eye of a firestorm and now stepped into a briefing room with unshakable steadiness. She didn't utter a single word yet. Her presence forced the entire room to confront how they had just treated her. Some looked down. Some glanced toward Knox. Some stared at the ceiling as if searching for a place to hide their shame. Rowan, meanwhile, had gone pale as though all the life had drained out of him. He realized his mistake wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a stain that would follow him for a long time. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Naomi lifted her eyes back to Holt, unwavering. In that moment, no one in the room needed further explanation to understand that the respect she commanded didn't come from rank. It came from the truth she had carried through years of combat. And in the shifting air of that room, a new path emerged, not one of revenge, but of the lesson Naomi was about to teach the youngest officer there. Admiral Holt kept his face cold as he looked straight at Rowan. In the room that was already silent, his voice dropped each word clear and heavy, like a sentence that could not be appealed. "Lieutenant Rowan, report to my office at 1500 with your CO." There was no gasp, no apology, no sign of resistance. Rowan simply bowed his head, his shoulders collapsing, as if the full weight of regret had fallen on him all at once. He couldn't say a word because any excuse he offered now would feel hollow against the truth laid bare in front of everyone. Just as the silence began to settle, Naomi took half a step forward. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to rescue his dignity, but her voice, soft yet resonant, seemed to place the balance back where it belonged. Admiral. He was trying to uphold the standard. He applied it poorly, but the intent wasn't malicious. The entire room shivered with surprise. No one expected her to speak on behalf of the man who had publicly humiliated her in front of every officer present. But Naomi wasn't acting to excuse his mistake. She did it because of principle, something everyone in that room should have understood better than anyone. Rowan heard her voice and lifted his head slowly. His eyes were blurred, unsure, embarrassed, struggling to understand how to face the woman he had doubted, mocked, and treated like an imposter only minutes before. Now she was standing up to offer him fairness, something he didn't deserve yet desperately needed. Naomi continued, her voice calm but sharp, like a blade honed with discipline. The standard must be applied fairly. To everyone. Every time. People in the room exchanged glances. Some who had stayed silent during Rowan's insults now felt her words strike them directly. A standard is only righteous when it isn't twisted by assumptions, and she had just reminded them of that in the simplest, clearest way possible. A flicker of memory passed through Naomi's mind, the catapult launching her from 0 to 160 in just 2 seconds. The crushing force pressing her entire body into the seat, the instruments jumping instantly, the air thick with salt and fuel. That moment allowed no mistakes. A tenth of a second off could cost a life. In her world, standard wasn't a slogan. It was the line dividing who lived and who didn't. She looked directly at Rowan. Not harsh, not contemptuous. Only with the steadiness of someone who had guided others out of the jaws of death. Next time you see a uniform, see the sailor wearing it. Not your assumptions. Rowan's breath caught in his throat. His lips trembled. He tried to make his voice steady, but the shame and gratitude twisting inside him were unmistakable. Yes, Commander. 2 simple words, but inside them lay the apology he couldn't yet speak and the promise that this mistake would become the greatest lesson of his military career. The room began to shift slowly. The earlier tension gave way to a deeper silence, the kind born of witnessing dignity being restored to its rightful place. And in that change, Naomi didn't seek victory. She did what someone carrying the call sign Spectre had always done, protect what is right, even when it meant confronting her own pain. And as everyone remained quiet, absorbing the lesson she had just delivered, the consequences of that morning quietly took root, ready to reshape the entire command in ways no one could yet foresee. After the incident in the briefing room that day, Lieutenant Rowan's reassignment order was issued almost immediately. He was removed from the sensitive position, where he had once believed he held real authority, and transferred to the logistics division, a quieter place with fewer confrontations, and most importantly, a place where his mistakes could no longer harm anyone's dignity. The decision wasn't a punishment. It was a way to force him to face the lesson he needed. Most responsibility begins with humility. Admiral Holt, however, did not let the matter pass like a gust of wind. He launched a new leadership training program focused on unconscious bias and the subtle ways favoritism can manifest, something many young officers were unaware of. The incident with Spectre Reyes was used as an anonymous case study, her name unmentioned, but those who knew understood exactly what the Admiral was trying to build, a force that was stronger, fairer, and more mature. The program received such positive response that even senior officers joined, treating it as a reminder that years of experience do not always translate into true understanding. From that incident, a new mentorship program was formed. Holt mandated that every junior officer be paired with a seasoned mentor, not just to learn procedures, but to learn how to see people, how to preserve dignity, and how to respect every uniform they encountered. Naomi was chosen as one of the first mentors, even though she had never asked for the role. She agreed with a simple nod because she understood that some lessons cannot be taught through manuals, they must be passed down through the way one lives. A few weeks later, among the aisles of the base commissary, Naomi was picking up some groceries after a long day in the flight simulator when Rowan appeared. He was in civilian clothes, one hand tucked in his pocket, as if trying to hide his discomfort. He hesitated before approaching, then spoke so softly that Naomi had to turn her head to hear him. "Commander Reyes, I'm sorry. I was wrong." The air around them seemed to lighten. No officers watching, no pressure of a classified briefing, just two human beings standing side by side in an ordinary moment. One who had made a mistake and one who had chosen forgiveness from the moment her dignity was restored. Naomi looked at him for a few seconds, her eyes free of the guardedness from before. She nodded gently, her voice steady and straight, like those who have endured far greater trials than a moment of human disrespect. "Then learn from it." Rowan swallowed hard, as if his throat was trying to push through the heavy stone of remorse. "I will. No excuses, no explanations. Just a simple promise, one so sincere that Naomi believed he would keep it." She watched him for another moment, then broke the overly serious atmosphere with a light, almost playful remark. "And tuck your shirt in, Lieutenant." Rowan's cheeks flushed instantly. He looked down at his slightly untucked shirt and quickly straightened it. The sight made Naomi smile, not a mocking smile, but the quiet smile of someone who had just witnessed growth emerging from the very place arrogance once stood. As she walked away from the aisle, the gold wings on her chest caught the overhead light. Every frayed thread seemed to tell part of her story. Discipline, honor, and nights spent on the razor's edge between life and death. But above all, they represented the humility she carried, even after standing in places where only the finest ever stand. A soldier's essence isn't found in what they say. It's found in what they choose to do when no one is watching. And in that moment, as Naomi walked through the familiar space of the base, people around her instinctively stepped aside, not because of her rank, but because her presence carried a dignity that made others stand a little straighter. The story ends, but its echo remains like a quiet heartbeat in those who have ever worn the uniform, reminding them that respect is not just a ritual, it is a responsibility. Veterans' legacy stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please share this video, and subscribe to Veterans' Legacy Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.